Chapter 1. The Beginning of a Summer Dream. The morning began with the first thrill of adventure, which woke Eliza even before the alarm. Outside the window, the rain, left over from the night, was noisy, but it quickly died down, giving way to clear, transparent air. Puddles, like mirrors, reflected the pinkening sky, and a light breeze swayed the branches of young maples. Eliza happily realized, today everything would be perfect. Margo was already waiting for her on the porch, habitually waving her old map. She held her backpack as if she was ready to go to the ends of the earth. Their laughter echoed across the yard when they exchanged glances and agreed on who was carrying what. Eliza took blankets and snacks, Margo flashlights, spare batteries, a compass and a first aid kit, just in case. Having gathered themselves, they jumped on their bikes and raced along the country road. The wind, cool and invigorating, ruffled their hair, and the morning sun sparkled on the dew on the grass along the roadside. They passed sleepy farms, greeted the cows lazily munching in the pastures, and excitedly discussed how they would set up camp in the heart of the forest, where no one would be able to find them until morning. Soon the forest began to loom like a green wall. They stopped at a giant oak tree, the same one that had symbolized the beginning of summer for them as children. The trunk with deep wrinkles seemed older than anything they knew. Eliza and Margo took dozens of photos, laughed, made faces, and then simply stood with their backs pressed against the tree, feeling the warmth of the bark and listening to the birds singing. Then, putting their phones in their backpacks, they stepped into the forest canopy. The air immediately changed, cool, damp, smelling of moss and something bittersweet, like unripe nuts. Light filtered through the leaves in thin stripes, coloring the pollen that danced in the sun's rays gold. Their steps on the soft bed of pine needles were silent, and the friends felt like they were walking along a path in a magical world. At first, everything was perfect. The path was wide and level. The trees stood on both sides like an honor guard, welcoming the guests. They enjoyed every moment. Listening to a woodpecker beat a rhythm deep in the forest, looking at the bizarre roots that resembled figures from old fairy tales. Margo even found a bird's nest full of tiny blue eggs, and admired it for a long time, carefully moving the branches aside, so as not to disturb the future chicks. Hours passed, the sun rose higher and higher, and the forest changed. The lark's songs became less frequent, the shadows deeper, and the path began to fork in unexpected places, as if mocking their confidence. Every now and then they stopped, laid the map on their laps, and checked the compass, but each new fork seemed similar to the previous one. Eliza encouraged Margo. "Isn't it great? We're like heroines of an adventure book." And they laughed until the laughter began to sound a little forced. But neither of them wanted to admit that they did not recognize the way back. At some point they reached a large clearing, where an abandoned hunting lodge stood under the shade of a spreading oak tree. Its roof was caved in, and the walls were covered with ivy. They decided to have a snack there. They got out sandwiches, a thermos of tea, and sweets. They ate in silence, enjoying the crunch of fresh vegetables and the sweetness of chocolate bars, listening to the rare sounds of the forest. And at that moment it seemed that the adventure was just beginning, a big, amazing one, full of discoveries. They did not yet know that from that day on the forest would begin to test them not only for endurance, but also for courage, patience and faith in each other. Chapter 2. In the Depths of the Green Labyrinth. When Eliza and Margo were about to continue their journey, the sun had already reached its zenith, and the forest was filled with thick shadows. The sounds around them had changed. The morning bird trills were replaced by the rare croaking of crows in the sky, and somewhere in the thicket, the wary cracking of branches could be heard. The forest seemed to be hiding, becoming quieter and heavier, and each shadow now seemed deeper and longer. At first, they were still laughing, discussing where to turn next, comparing the map with the signs on the trees, but with each hour, the landmarks began to disappear. Instead of the bright paths that had been in the morning, They came across the same intertwining roots and identical boulders covered with old moss. The forest was like a green labyrinth that played with them, changing its passages and twists. The friends tried to stay calm. They recalled childhood stories about forest spirits, discussed who they would play in an adventure movie, and sang their favorite songs to keep the fear out of their voices. But gradually their words became shorter, the pauses longer, and their gazes darted from one similar tree to another. Time passed. At some point, they realized that the sun was setting, and they had not moved a single meter towards the exit. With each passing minute, the forest became darker and colder, as if the night was about to come faster than usual. The sounds of the forest also changed. They became sharper, as if someone was walking nearby. Rustling, crunching branches, creaks that echoed in their hearts. Margo began to shiver not only from the cold, but also from the feeling that they were walking in circles. Eliza tried not to show her fear, but all the horror stories they had told each other at their overnight stays were spinning around in her head. She was loudly arguing that they just needed to go west, but the forest was thick, and even the sky was no longer visible through the dense crowns. Suddenly the path forked at an old tree with a hollow that looked like a gaping mouth. The friends stood in indecision, sorting through the map, on which everything merged into one green spot. The compass arrow pointed north, but in the dense forest it didn't help. Neither of them could tell where they were. Then Eliza decided to climb the nearest hill to try to see at least some kind of sign. With great difficulty, clinging to the branches, they got to the top, but the forest stretched around in all directions, without a gap, only a silent green mass, over which the clouds were slowly thickening. At that moment, the first drops of rain fell on their faces. They looked at each other, and for the first time, their eyes simultaneously reflected fatigue, fear and understanding. They really were lost. Chapter 3. Night in the Heart of the Forest. Darkness fell upon the forest like a heavy, cold wave. The sun had long since disappeared behind the horizon, and even the faint glow of the sunset that had broken through the clouds had dissolved into the pitch black. The shadows of the trees had become a single mass, in which it was impossible to discern either a path or a direction. The rain was getting heavier with each passing minute, and wet drops fell on their faces like icy needles. The friends took shelter under a massive fallen tree, its roots forming a kind of cave. It was a little drier inside, but the cold was piercing. The ground beneath them had turned into viscous, sticky mud, and every time they moved, a disgusting squelching sound was heard. From time to time, the tree trembled from gusts of wind, and it seemed that it was about to collapse completely. The storm approached slowly, but inexorably. At first, the sky only faintly sparkled with lightning behind the mountains, but soon the first peals of thunder began to spread through the forest, echoing off the tree trunks and cliffs. These sounds were like distant explosions, as if a battle of giants was taking place somewhere nearby. With each peal, they felt their hearts begin to beat faster, as the cold clings to their throats. Sitting in their shaky cave, Eliza tried to distract Margo by telling stories about stupid classmates and fun trips to grandma's, but their voices sounded tired and afraid. Every rustle outside was perceived as the steps of something unknown. When a hare ran past their shelter with a crash, they both screamed and cowered, and then laughed for a long time through their tears, trying to disperse the trembling in their legs. At some point, they tried to make a small fire from the branches they found under the roots. But the wet wood only smoldered, releasing acrid smoke and fumes that made them cough and tear up. After several unsuccessful attempts, Margo simply lay down on her side, snuggling up to Eliza, who covered them both with a blanket, which was now half-soaked. Time slowed to excruciating seconds. It seemed that the night would never end, that dawn was just a myth. They began to count in their heads, so as not to lose the sense of time. First to 100, then again and again. The counting was lost from fear, and they had to start over. This helped not to go mad with terror in the endless darkness. Suddenly the thunderstorm was right above them. With a blinding flash, the sky cracked with white light, and for a moment the world seemed to be in slow motion. The forest covered with silver rain, and their frightened faces reflected in each other. The thunder struck so close that the ground shook and heavy drops fell from the branches like hail. They covered their ears with their hands, trying to block out the terrible sound, but the roar still penetrated their very bones. After each clap, they sat with their foreheads pressed together, silently sharing their fear and weak hope with each other. The storm seemed to last for hours. The rain did not stop, and the wind howled in the tops of the pines as if the forest was singing its old, dark song to them. Sometimes it seemed that right in the darkness, very close, someone or something was watching them, a night beast or the spirit of the forest itself. But in the depths of this terrifying night, they began to feel how fear slowly gave way to stubborn determination. Every touch to each other, every short glance gave them the strength not to give up. They understood that if they held out until dawn, they would get out of this nightmare together. And when the rain began to subside, and the storm moved further behind the mountains, they crawled out of their shelter, wrapped in a dirty blanket, and leaning on each other, took the first step into the night, which was still full of rustlings and dark shadows, but no longer seemed impassable to them. Chapter 4. Dawn of Hope. The first harbingers of dawn were rare gaps in the clouds. Their edges began to glow gray, then silvery, and finally light pink. Eliza and Margo, shivering from cold and fatigue, stood on a barely visible path, clinging to each other as if to a last anchor. They took a few uncertain steps, and wet leaves began to slide under their feet, but they did not stop. The forest no longer seemed like a hostile labyrinth, but a test that needed to be passed. The light slowly spread along the tree trunks, painting the wet bark with amber highlights. Moisture from the leaves dripped in rare drops, as if counting down the time until full dawn. In these first rays, the forest was transformed. The green tones became brighter, the fresh smell after the night rain filled the lungs, and the fog, creeping along the ground, gave everything a mystical beauty. They walked slowly but surely, clinging to every sign. An old fallen pine tree, a strangely curved stump, a huge boulder that looked like a sleeping bear. These familiar landmarks gave them hope. It meant they weren't circling in one place. It meant there was a way. Margo was the first to notice a faint trace of a path leading down the hill. She cried out with joy, and Eliza couldn't help but laugh through her tears. The sound spread through the forest and returned to them as an echo, which no longer sounded ominous, but like a friendly response from the forest itself. With every step, the world around them filled with life. With the first rays of the sun, birds woke up. Their voices sounded especially clear and ringing after the night storm. The forest was filled with the rustling of awakening animals, the rustling of the wind in the leaves, drops falling from the branches onto the mossy ground. This morning forest was not at all what it seemed at night. There was no longer fear, only a feeling of endless space and freedom. Suddenly the path turned sharply, and a view of a wide clearing opened up before them, behind which a line of a country road was visible. It stretched towards the village, from where they began their adventure. On the horizon, the sun was slowly rising, filling everything around with golden light. The friends looked at each other, and in these looks there were more words than could be said in 1,000 conversations. Joy, relief, pride in each other, and the understanding that together they were able to get through the night that almost broke them. Eliza sank down on the grass and closed her eyes, exposing her face to the warm rays. Margo stood next to her and raised her hands to the sky, as if embracing the dawn. They laughed, cried, screamed with delight and freedom, and the forest around sounded like an orchestra playing the hymn of their victory. When they came out onto the road, the sun had already fully risen above the forest. As if to mark the end of their ordeal, the sky cleared of the last wisps of clouds, and a new day dawned, clear, fresh, promising that now everything would be different. The friends, hugging, set off along the road to the house. They knew this adventure had changed them forever, made them stronger, united them, and gave them the most important thing: the confidence that together they were capable of anything. And the forest, which had frightened and tested them all night, was now behind them, and in their memory, as the place where they learned to be truly brave.